Hello everyone and welcome back to JB's Total Gaming. It's been a while since we've done a Star Wars book review, and today I'm excited to talk to you about Star Wars Dark Disciple by Christie Golden. As per usual, I will be discussing the audiobook of this, and like every other audiobook version of the Star Wars books, they are fantastically done. The person who does these books are great. It is done in somewhat a radio play style where you have different sound effects and subtle use of like Star Wars music and things like that, or maybe not so subtle depending on your taste. But overall, I think if you're cool with that, the idea of having these kind of cool effects, and really one person who does a pretty fantastic job of having to do a wide range of voices. Obviously, they're not all perfect, but some of them are pretty spot on, and overall a great job in the audiobook department. So what is Dark Disciple? Well, this is a book that I wasn't initially all that interested in when I heard about it. It's based on a storyline that was written for the show The Clone Wars and ended up not making it into the show because the show had been canceled. And well, in general, The Clone Wars wasn't very good in my opinion. There were a few fantastic episodes, there were a few really good story arcs. Overall, I don't think the show was that great, and I was a little bit worried that the book would feel a little too much like the show. However, the person who originally wrote these stories, who I believe were Katie Lucas, actually, those stories were then taken and then put into this book, whereas the author actually wrote the book. So they obviously have a slightly different tone. And to be honest, they're not quite as children-oriented as the show is. Now, I don't want to say that it's like a real adult book or that somewhat younger listeners couldn't listen to this. It's not like full of like graphic violence or a whole lot of sexual content, although there is some adult relationship type stuff going on. It's not talked about in like a graphic sense, so I will say that. So while I wasn't super interested in what this book initially had to offer, Jesse Cox and the guys at the New Canon Book Club podcast, I go suggest checking them out. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, were saying they were going to cover this one next, and they seem to really like it, although a lot of people really didn't. And here's what I will start out by saying. I personally like this book. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I could definitely see why some people might not have. So let's talk about a little bit about the story of the actual book. We won't do spoilers or anything. This is all kind of beginning stuff, the premise of the book, and who I think this book is going to be for, and who's actually going, who's going to enjoy this book and who should avoid it, because that's one of the things I really try to do on this channel, is try to be as consumer friendly as possible. So the premise of this storyline is based around two main characters, Asajj Ventress, who, if you watch the Clone Wars at all, you're familiar with. If you're not familiar with, she is one of the Night Sisters. Now, the Night Sisters are kind of loosely based on a thing in the old canon that's been rearranged. In the old canon, there was a group of Jedi that had crashed on this planet, and then just these female Force users ended up coming up, kind of dominating this planet. And over a long time, because they had been basically abandoned there and had no way of getting off, things evolved and they became almost like spellcasters. Like they would speak words and doing the Force, and they did things that Luke didn't really know anything about. This was in The Courtship of Princess Leia, technically, I think the first book chronologically after Return of the Jedi in the old canon. It's kind of a cool concept. The Night Sisters in this are different than that group was, whereas they are a little bit different. They use the Force slightly differently than other beings, and they are certainly dark, but they're not Sith, and that's a key distinction. Now, these females are from the same planet as Darth Maul, and they have some similarities. They don't tend to have like spikes and things like that. But Asajj Ventress is an interesting character. She kind of left the Night Sisters, became the apprentice of Count Dooku, kind of his assassin and his apprentice. He eventually became disappointed with her and kicked her out. She went back to the Night Sisters. And the Night Sisters, again, are odd because they use the dark side of the Force, but it's a big thing where they don't let it control them. They don't let it consume them. They pull upon the dark side of the Force, but it's a different way of looking at it than the Sith, who are all about revenge and this and that, and letting that hatred just overtake them, whereas the Night Sisters will pull in that hatred, but there's a level of control that Sith aren't known to have, and the idea of actually keeping yourself, and we might talk about this a little bit later, even the idea of gray Jedi or things like that, they're they use the dark side of the Force. They're not really a gray Jedi who uses both the dark and light side kind of equally as they see fit, or doesn't even really believe in that. They know it's a dark side of the Force. They just control it better. And the thing is, this character was pretty evil and nasty at points during the show, but there are also points where, after things had gone poorly for her, you saw that maybe there was a little bit more humanity than you might have expected to this character, which is why I thought that this was a character I actually really liked. And part of the reason, even though I didn't really like the Clone Wars, I liked Ventress, so that was part of the reason I was interested in this. And then the other character this focuses in on is Quinlan Vos, another character who you might hear a snippet of here or there, but wasn't all that big in the Star Wars lore, but is kind of a bit of a loose cannon, not in the same way as Qui-Gon Jinn, who is respectful in a way but has his own ideals. This guy is a little bit more similar to Anakin or even Han Solo if he was a Jedi. He's kind of relaxed, he's personable, he is outgoing, and he's been someone, for example, that the Jedi would send on covert operations, fitting in with a gang of criminals or something like that. He's capable of doing these sort of things, and is good at it. So, he's definitely has a little bit of more interesting personality than, a Jedi who's just completely kind of deadpan. So, basically, the idea that at the start of this book, again, no spoilers here, is that the Jedi Council is looking at the idea of how things are going, and Mace Windu in particular is like, hey, this Clone War, we're losing so many lives, it's just going on and on forever. What if we could stop Dooku? Then maybe we could put an end to this war. And we haven't been able to capture him, we haven't been able to do this or that. What if we just assassinate him? And of course, Obi-Wan is like, whoa, what are you talking about? This isn't the Jedi way. But eventually enough of the council was kind of for it, and there's this idea of, well, killing the one can save many, so it's worthwhile. And even Yoda, although he doesn't seem to initially like this idea, kind of goes along with it despite not liking it. He can see the logic in it even if he doesn't like it, and eventually agrees to it. Enough of the council agrees, and even though Obi-Wan's not behind it, he actually recommends Quinlan Vos for this mission. There's the idea, though, well, and the other thing, I can't remember if he recommends Quinlan Vos or not, but he definitely does recommend a certain little twist on it, in that this guy's already good at doing covert operations, convincing people he's other people. What if he recruits Asajj Ventress? So this is kind of the idea that Ventress has already attempted to assassinate Dooku, I believe, twice at this point in the Clone Wars, and failed, but hasn't had quite the ally that Quinlan could be. So Quinlan's mission is to go off, convince Asajj Ventress that he is just a bounty hunter. He's not supposed to reveal that he's a Jedi, but convince her to eventually go after Dooku, which she probably is going to want to do eventually. Although they warn him that she can be a trickster, a temptress, all this, and then the plot ensues. So this is a pretty interesting book in that it's and not interesting for some people, in that it's not a big scope book. It's not going to tell you a whole lot of things you didn't know about the universe, and if you're into more sweeping things that cover all kinds of stuff going on and have big sweeping changes, if you're interested in the main line books, kind of the main story of what's going on, then I still recommend the Aftermath books 1, 2, and 3, even though one's pretty bad. If you're just interested in that main overarching story. And I do think Bloodline, in my opinion, is the best books of the new canon books out so far. That one isn't a huge, broad, sweeping thing, whereas it mostly follows around Leia and one other character. However, I feel like if you're wondering what happened between episodes 6 and 7, that book has the most information. I also did a video on that as well if you want to check that out. So if you're interested in the more broad sweeping things, those are what I would suggest. This is a very focused story mainly on these two characters, and pretty much almost entirely on these two characters, and that may not interest some people who are interested in broader things. There is quite a bit of action that goes on, maybe a little too much for some people's taste, and there definitely is still somewhat of a feel of this is multiple stories of a story arc for a television show. You get a little bit of that feel. There's one point in particular I felt like, with about 4 hours in the audio, a little bit more than that, of the audiobook left, where I felt like the book could have just ended there and I would have been happy with that ending. It would have been shorter book, obviously, maybe a little bit too short at that point, because there's obvious like kind of cliffhangers and major plot things that happen throughout. You can kind of feel maybe those sections a little bit. But overall, I think the transition from these scripts for the show to the book went pretty well, and I enjoyed the ride. And here's the deal, in my opinion, if you were looking for kind of a fun ride, and particularly if you know about Asajj and you like her as a character, then I say check out this book. You'll enjoy it. If you either didn't watch or didn't enjoy Clone Wars, it's a maybe. If you really didn't like Asajj, and probably not, because it really does focus on her and Quinlan. However, I feel like it was an enjoyable ride. There are a couple of things that I had frustrations with, but if you're just looking for something fun, a little bit more Star Wars leading up until Episode 8 coming out, then I had a fun time with this book. There was enough that went on between these two characters. I thought the two characters were well enough written that it was an enjoyable ride. And if you're looking for more than an enjoyable ride, then this isn't really going to be for you. Now, there were some issues I had later on in the book with something that I feel like happens a lot in television shows and some movies, particularly in longer running things, although in some shorter running ones as well, where a character does things that don't make sense because plot. Basically, there was a thing that I was like, this is what's going on. And then things were happening, and I was like, well, that can't be what's going on, because then this wouldn't. And then that actually ended up being what was going on. And if there was just this other thing that would have happened, it would have solved a lot of things, and why that never happened, I don't know. But anyways, I had a few problems with the last section, probably what would have been the last episode in the story arc, with some things that I felt a little frustrated by. So if that's something that bothers you when you're like, wait a minute, why is this going on? Why is this character doing this or not doing this or whatever? That might be a little frustrating. But overall, if you're not interested in adventure, stay away. If you're not interested in just a fun ride, stay away. However, if you're all right with the idea of kind of a fun ride that is, I don't even want to call it adolescent, but it's not as serious as some other things. It's just enjoyable, and also Dooku obviously is going to play a factor in this. If you like or dislike Dooku as a character, that might be something else to bear in mind as well. In my opinion, he's a character that was somewhat interesting but a little bit underdeveloped. I'm not sure if this book is going to really develop him all that much for you, but again, it's fun, and overall I think the transition from television story to book was done better than I expected. And if you know those caveats going in about why you may not enjoy it if you're expecting more or something different, then obviously, stay away if that's not for you. But if you're okay with those caveats, then overall, I felt like this was a pretty fun ride and worth a read or a listen. Particularly in my case, a listen, I may have enjoyed it a little bit more because of the production on those audiobooks. Now, lastly, there is something I want to throw out. This isn't necessarily part of my book review. It's just a little bit of conjecture about what's going on in the Star Wars universe. This is not a spoiler. Again, I thought about doing a spoiler section. We're not really going to do that, though. This is just a real brief thing at kind of some concepts that were talked about in this book that I think potentially lead into something that may be going on in Episode 8. So, The Last Jedi. Is that the title of the next movie because Luke is currently the Last Jedi, or is that the title because Luke actually will be the Last Jedi? So, if you watch the trailers carefully, you might think there's a little bit of an implication that at some point Luke maybe decides not to train Rey, that maybe he realizes how powerful she is and he backs off, so there won't be any more Jedi. I don't necessarily think that will be the case. I think Luke is going to be scared of Rey's powers. I mean, the fact that she was able to beat a trained Sith apprentice in a fight with a lightsaber with no lightsaber training, like, dude, Rey is powerful, whoever she is. But honestly, the mystery of who Rey is and who her parents are interests me less than if Thrawn's going to be in it, what happened to Sloane and Thrawn, and in that time in between where the books left off and Episode 7 started, and what they were trying to seek in the far reaches of space. Again, watch my videos on maybe Aftermath or stuff like that if you want to know what I'm talking about there. But what's going on with some of the Empire stuff. Is Snoke the thing that people are afraid of in the unknown space? Stuff like that. Those stories interest me more. However, Rey's ability is something that obviously scares Luke, but I think there's also something else that scares Luke. I have a theory that isn't just, I mean, I've heard this theory, but I had this theory before I heard it too, that Luke has decided that the Jedi are done, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to train Rey. What do I mean by that? Well, they also showed this book that could be like the book of the Jedi and like the Jedi mantra and all that you see in other things. There is no this, there's only this, stuff like that you may have heard before. But anyways, or it could be the Book of the Wills, which the Wills are mentioned real briefly in some other stuff. They're mentioned in the Rogue One, where there's the temple, the Guardians of the Wills, and the things like that. The Wills, really quick, this concept Lucas had originally, these powerful beings that were actually going to tell the story as narrators. These beings kind of eventually became the Force, if you will, but they're bringing the idea of the Wills back in. Anyway, it's a long story. But whatever that book is, whether it's the Book of the Wills that we see in the trailer or it's like just the Jedi teachings, I think Luke has had a lot of time to think about the teachings of the Jedi and where maybe they have gone wrong. I think maybe he's found some holocrons, he's found some information, he found some things that along with a bunch of other evidence, has made him question the whole Jedi Order. We see the Jedi if you're as old as me, then you saw 4, 5, and 6 first, and the Jedi seemed like this really cool concept that you didn't really get to see full-fledged. Then when we see in the prequels, maybe the Jedi weren't as cool as we thought they were. Sure, their abilities are cool, but they're kind of dumb. They make some dumb mistakes. This, no attachments, trying to block feelings, all this stuff, it doesn't work out. People go off and have secret marriages. Obi-Wan, there's even a theory that Rey is like Obi-Wan's granddaughter, because in the Clone Wars they talk about a relationship he had with this Mandalorian warrior, and I mean it doesn't seem to work. And then maybe the idea of this absolutely not, you can't even think about the dark side, you can't whatever, makes it more of a temptation, and then when a Jedi is confronted with it, they can't handle it. There seem to be plenty of examples of that. Luke eventually, depending on how you look at it, Luke maybe eventually being the person who does bring balance to the Force because he was able to resist the temptation of the dark side. But for the most part, there's a lot of examples of how this hasn't worked out, and maybe we don't know exactly what happened, but the idea is that at some point when Luke was training, Ben, Kylo Ren, whatever you want to call him, that either he broke off or him and a group of people that became the Knights of Ren. We're not sure when the Knights of Ren officially formed or what happened, if they were other Jedi trainees or maybe they're not even Force sensitive. We don't know, but we do know that he went bad. And the idea is maybe he killed off the other Jedi trainees, or him and the Knights of Ren killed off the other Jedi trainees, or some of the Jedi trainees are the Knights of Ren and they killed off the ones who didn't join them. Whatever the case may be, there's a lot of evidence that the Jedi way just doesn't actually work all that well, and there's some indications of this in this book. There's the idea of Mace Windu, and at first I was like, would Mace really want to assassinate Dooku? But then again, we have evidence even in the movies of Mace wanting to finish off the Emperor rather than capture him and things like that, where okay, maybe he would feel that's justified. We have these indications of these Jedi not being able to handle the temptation, and maybe Luke says, you know what, enough of that. We're going to learn about the Force as an entity, as the Force as a whole, because one of the concepts that's been in the old extended universe, it was in a lot of it's been mentioned, a lot of people talk about it, but it isn't really officially part of actual new Star Wars canon. Is the idea of a gray Jedi, a Jedi who can equally call upon the light and the dark, isn't controlled or compelled by one, can use them with the understanding that it doesn't control him. He is just he or she is able to call upon the Force as they see fit, as kind of an entity, as something that is nothing. One of my favorite sayings, nothing is intrinsically good or evil, but its manner of usage may make it so. That even calling upon the dark side of the Force isn't necessarily evil, the light side isn't necessarily good, the Force isn't necessarily one of those two things, it is all. And maybe ultimately bringing balance to the Force is Force users accepting this concept of maybe the dark and the light side isn't as clear as we think it is. And the idea of the Grey Jedi or a new order of Force users who aren't Jedi will be born in Episode 8. I say that because of some stuff that happens in this book. We see the Jedi being kind of stupid at points. We see them being stupid at a lot of points in the prequel. And Asajj Ventress certainly isn't a Grey Jedi, but after she turns away from the Sith and doesn't allow the dark side to control her, you could see that as almost like a proto-Grey Jedi, where she's using the dark side but not allowing it to consume her, which is exactly what a Grey Jedi would have to do. He would just have to be trained in the Force as a whole and be able to do that. So it's an interesting concept, something to think about for Episode 8, and I probably spent more time talking about that than I should, but it's something that I'm excited to see what's going to happen in Episode 8 as far as that is concerned. So overall, should you check out Dark Disciple? If you're okay with not an all that mature, not a very broad sweeping story about a couple of characters and kind of a wild romp going after Dooku and somebody trying to pretend not to be a Jedi, will they be able to accomplish that? Will they be taken in by the allure of Asajj Ventress? Will they be taken in by the allure of the dark side? You can probably assume they don't kill Dooku, because spoilers, Anakin does. I'm assuming you've seen the movies. So, but even with that, I think it's a pretty good ride. And overall, while I can see why a lot of people wouldn't like it, I think the transition from show to book was actually done pretty well by the author. So hopefully that helped you make an informed decision on it. If there's interest, we can do a spoiler video on what happens in the book and whatnot. I don't know if you enjoyed the conjecture about The Last Jedi or not, but anyways, thanks a lot for watching, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.